The case studies, the case study panels that we just completed on Nigeria, Cuba, and Iraq, I know the time went far too fast and there was far too much to do in a very short period of time. But so that we give everyone a flavor for what occurred in each of the three sessions, we have reporters who are going to give very short 3-4 minute, not a summary of what happened, but some key insights that emerged. Some key insights that emerged. So for Nigeria, we should have Paul Miller. Is Paul Miller here? Please, Paul. And then on deck, Sandra and Ginny, ready?
Thank you, Steve. I said to the smaller group that I would require the blessing of all the bishops present in order to distill the rich and the complex discussion that we had and the very interesting ways in which His Grace Archbishop Anayakan and Father Okuri laid out some of the panorama of religious freedom and discrimination and persecution in Nigeria. I don't have the time to do that, but I will certainly give you a flavor of that, and then indeed some of the strategies to respond in the complex case of Nigeria. A couple of key points from the beginning. Overall, as Archbishop Anayakan said, Nigeria is a country which guarantees freedom of religion in the Constitution, that the state will not adopt any religion as its state religion. So in that sense, freedom of worship is guaranteed. And indeed, there are Muslims and Christians everywhere in the country, though a predominance of some in some parts rather than others. And there's intermarriage as well, even within families. There are families and His Grace's own family where he has relatives who may be Muslim. So it is in many ways Nigeria, the religious aspect of Nigeria also reflects this rich tapestry of ethnicities and religions, etc. At the same time, there is and it is also generally peaceful coexistence in many parts of the country, and indeed, in fact, one could say that Christians overall don't necessarily feel persecuted in a general way. Yet at the same time, the weight of history, as well as other recent events, have made this more positive situation look much worse. In the north, Sharia law and a number of different ways in which the church is under threat and under persecution means that Christians are not at ease practicing their religion, and indeed a number of different violent events have occurred. Some of these are not directly related to religion, and some are. The other aspect that was mentioned in particular was Boko Haram, a terrorist organization which has targeted many people and the security forces, but also Christian churches, as we heard from Cardinal Dolan at the beginning of our seminar. What to do? The strategies that were named ran the gamut, but within Nigeria, continuing the interfaith dialogue, continuing to restrain our mad dogs, as the Archbishop said, both on the Christian and on the Muslim side, clarifying the Constitution are critical. The solidarity visits from abroad are very important, from the Holy See, from ecumenical delegations, and from the Muslim world as well. What can the U.S. Congress, what can the USCCB, what can the U.S. Congress and the administration do? The USCCB has a strong voice and should continue to use it, and that will be of utmost importance. But for the U.S. Congress and for the administration, put pressure on the Nigerian government to reduce impunity of its security forces and of all who commit crimes. Don't designate Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization because that could certainly actually make the situation more difficult. There are a number of other recommendations that were made, and indeed we can talk about them later.
Thank you. Paul Miller is the foreign aid advisor at Catholic Relief Services. I forgot to mention that in calling him forward, and thank you for a very concise summary. And as you can tell, there was a rich discussion beyond that, and so over dinner, hopefully you'll get to hear from people who are in that session. To discuss Iraq, we have Virginia Ferris, who's a foreign policy advisor in the Office of International Justice and Peace at the Bishops' Conference. Ginny?
Thank you. We had a very extensive discussion of what was happening in Iraq, the attacks that are occurring on Christians in Iraq, and their implications for the whole Middle East. And obviously these attacks are creating a lot of instability and insecurity. But beyond that, the problems that Iraqis face, Iraqi religious minorities face, include some legal barriers related to the constitution, discrimination within the government and in terms of economic opportunity, also obviously terrorist attacks that focus on using minorities as pawns in terms of trying to gain advantage. Among the strategies that would work to improve religious freedom, one would be to build the judicial capacity to enforce rule of law consistent with democratic principles and protection of religious freedom for all. Also, through this, you'd be able to address the security issues and impunity through laws and adherence to a judicial system that respects the rights of all. There was suggestion that a coalition of leaders try to pressure for some of these changes. Archbishop Chullikat mentioned that the church itself continues through its efforts to continue to reinforce its presence through health and education facilities and provision of other services is also a way to demonstrate that we are there, we intend to stay there, and we intend to be part of the community. In terms of what can be done to advance religious freedom, the important thing was for church-based, faith-based institutions, as well as the government and other non-governmental institutions, to stand in solidarity, to stand up for the rights for minorities, particularly those who have been attacked. Tina Ramirez gave a very dramatic account of one Armenian Christian who was had a very prominent position, lost that position, tried to appeal, lost the appeal. The appeal was but then ultimately was upheld, only to have to retire. Again, the suggestion was made that a coalition of world leaders going to Iraq to support the right to believe would have implications for the whole Middle East if that were to happen. Also, a suggestion was made that there be dialogue among Muslims of good faith and with Christians and Muslims to try and advance religious freedom for all. What can Congress and administration do? Basically, to support some of these efforts, financially as well as through other means, to support efforts to reform the judiciary, to help train judiciary so that the whole issue of impunity is overcome, and to also look at urging the Iraqi government to support some of their own efforts to respect human rights and to implement some of the plans that they've already made to, at least plans that they've discussed but not yet implemented in terms of human rights. And last, the suggestion was made to speed up the processing of Iraqi refugees, and what the faith-based community can look to that in terms of trying to urge the U.S. government to do that.
Buenas tardes. On the Cuban panel, I thought we can actually start with one of the final comments that Cardinal O'Malley had, which was that the church is actually moving from a church of survival in Cuba to a church of renewal. For many decades, as many of you know, Cuba and the church had been at odds, and there has been some movement, and there has been some resiliency along that route. The church is making its spaces wherever the government is making a little bit of movement back or encouraging some engagement. The church is making those spaces, moving into those spaces, and trying as much as it can to not only help the people of Cuba in a humanitarian effort, but to support the church and the preachings of the church. There were some key elements that came Key words that already echoed in two of the other panels. The words of transparency, being very transparent in the role of the church and the work of the church, because trust and confianza is very important to creating that work with the government, the Cuban government, who can at any moment shut down the work of the Cuban priests and archbishops there and of the lay people. It's not as much persecution as there has been in the past. People no longer lose their jobs, perhaps, for openly professing their faith, but those things can still happen. In other ways, we can engage and we can continue the persistence, the willingness to start again and again and again, again and again. Other elements that were brought up, Archbishop Wensky pointed out that it has been better than it has been, but not what it should be. And in doing this work of moving forward the Catholic faith, we should do no harm. Especially the American government should do no harm in our policies and in our iterations. So some of the recommendations is to think, I think, before speaking or doing, and to consider the inside approaches of the Cuban church there and the Cuban archbishops there, and to support the efforts carefully and thoughtfully. Another element that was key is the element of reconciliation between the Cubans on the island and the Cubans here in the United States. Because we're coming to a point, and I think, again, Archbishop Wensky did a wonderful point here with the roller coaster example, that we hopefully, eventually, we're getting there with decades, are moving towards some freedom for Cuba. Freedom of religion, freedom of politics. But as we're moving towards that element, the Cuban people need to come together from all sides, from the religious sides as well as the political side, so that we can get to this softer landing for government and for the church. Thank you.
That was Dr. Sandro Barreco, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology and a Fellow in the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at the Catholic University.